Business Diplomacy Today, the podcast about international relations and geopolitics from a business perspective. We help you anticipate the changing political and societal trends that influence your business.
Welcome. My name is Matthias Catón. I'm your host. Business Diplomacy Today is sponsored by the Indo-German Center for Business Excellence. The center is a think tank, research center, and network that connects people and organizations interested in business relations between India and Germany. As an academic institution founded in 2021 at Frankfurt School of Finance and Management, it is independent and impartial, but always close to the real world. To find out more about the center, please go to indogerman.center, and you can also find this link in the show notes. Welcome. Today we're joined by Professor Sugata Bose, the Gardiner Professor of Oceanic History and Affairs at Harvard University. A historian of international repute, Professor Bose has a rich academic and political background, having served as a member of parliament in India, and he contributed significantly to the discourse on modern South Asia and the concept of Asianness. His latest work, just out, is called Asia After Europe, and it explores the evolution of Asian identity against the backdrop of European universalism. And that makes him, of course, a fascinating guest for discussing the shifting global power dynamics and look at those from a business and a geopolitical perspective. Professor Bose, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be with you.
So let me begin with asking you the question, do you think that we are actually either already in or at the beginning of a century that could be described as Asia's century?
I think we are. Asia lost out to Europe exactly about 200 years ago. It was in the early 19th century, in the 1810s or the 1820s, that you see the great divergence in the economic fortunes of Europe and Asia. Europe began to grow rich and Asia became poor. But that economic divergence was also accompanied by a grave sense of political loss, as many European countries colonized different parts of Asia. I think that in the 2020s, the global balance of power, both economic and political, has shifted. And to a certain degree, Asia has or is beginning to recover the global position that it had lost approximately 200 years ago.
Now, you mentioned Europe, you mentioned Asia. Of course, Europe is already a fairly big and also quite diverse place. Asia, as a geographic area, is even bigger and arguably even more diverse. So to what extent can one actually even speak of something like an Asian identity?
Well, that is exactly the question that I explore in my book, Asia After Europe. Now, of course, there were European geographers and cartographers who had defined Asia. But I look at how Asians themselves imagined their own continent and relations among Asians from about the late 19th century to nearly the present. And what I argue is that these Asian imaginations had creative spark that was absent in European cartographic depictions of Asia. Now, of course, it is true that Asia is as diverse, if not more, than Europe. And so one had to search out commonalities. It was important for Asians to figure out what it was that brought them together, how they could learn from one another. And what I will say is that I am more interested in the idea of Asia than in the map of Asia. At one level, I look at Asia as a huge expanse stretching from Turkey in the west to Japan in the east, but it is not as if I'm giving equal attention to the different countries of Asia. I'm looking at Asian connections. So it's an exploration of the links, the various conversations that occurred among people coming from different parts of Asia. So it's only by privileging the idea of Asia over the map of Asia has it been possible for me to write a book on such a large canvas.
Can you maybe give our listeners, and of course we will talk a little bit more about your book also in the course of our conversation, and we will certainly recommend it to our listeners to look into that and to learn more about the subject. But maybe you can give our listeners an idea of what that might mean, these Asian connections. Can you give us a concrete example of what that might mean in practice, either contemporary or historically?
Yes. I know that your podcast is more interested in business and diplomacy. But let me give you an example from the world of art. So at the beginning of the 20th century, in December 1901 to be precise, a Japanese art critic called Okakura Tenshin arrived in Calcutta. And he had many conversations, intellectual, political, but also artistic, with various intellectuals based in India, including Rabindranath Tagore, who would go on to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913. And after he went back to Japan, having spent a year in India, he sent renowned Japanese artists to India. One of them was Yokoyama Taikkan, and he taught a nephew of Rabindranath, a well-known artist called Abanindranath Tagore, the Japanese wash technique. And in 1905, when in Bengal in India, there was a Swadeshi or an own country movement, Abanindranath painted an image of Bharat Mata or Mother India, utilizing the Japanese wash technique that he had been taught by Taikkan. And so, these are the kinds of connections that I explore. This was an example of Japanese-Indian conversations. But think about India and China. There was a famous Chinese artist called Xu Beihong who came and spent several months in Tagore's university in Shantiniketan in Bengal in 1940. And then later on in 1952, a very famous Indian artist, not so famous at that time, M.F. Hussain, went to Beijing and visited the studio of Xu Beihong, and there he saw his 1,000 horses, and that encouraged Hussain to lend more vigor to his horses. So it's really, I'm trying to give you a concrete example from the world of art, but of course also in the world of politics and economics, there were many attempts to build Asian solidarity. Anti-colonial activists in particular, in the first half of the 20th century, traveled across the continent and forged solidarities with one another. So these connections straddled affective bonds, intimacies, but also broader political solidarities, and all in the context of a sense of Asia having lost economic and political power from the early 19th century onwards. And the idea was, how can we recover the position that we have lost? So the material history, the phases of poverty, and more recently some prosperity, provides the backdrop to my exploration of how Asians were trying to imagine their own continent and relations with one another.
Fascinating, and I think art is a very important part of society. Our listeners won't be able to see that, but you can see it behind me. There is a painting hanging on the wall, so I'm very much interested in art. My office is full of different pieces of art that I have hung up here, so I think this is very interesting. But as you said, rightly so, we mostly focus on business and geopolitics in our podcast, and you mentioned that as well. You used the term solidarity. Now, you're from India. That's your native country. You served in parliament for your country. Now, if I look at India, so I would say probably the biggest international foes of India, if you may use that term, are two of its neighbors, Pakistan to the one side and China to the other side. So both are obviously also Asian countries. Looking at that on the backdrop of what you define solidarity, Asian solidarity, is there even such a thing as Asian solidarity if you consider those conflicts that are going on in the region?
As a historian, I explore how various kinds of solidarities were forged. And certainly before the partition of India and the creation of Pakistan in 1947, at the moment of independence, there had been various efforts to build unity among Hindus and Muslims. Unfortunately, there was a failure at the moment of formal political decolonization, and therefore the subcontinent was divided ostensibly along religious lines. If you look at China, I show how from the late 19th, early 20th century onwards, there were many attempts to build connections, and that continued even after India's independence in 1947 and the Communist Revolution in China in 1949. In fact, in my book, I explore many fascinating, shall we say, civil society initiatives, even in the 1950s, when there were Indian and Chinese cultural delegations visiting one another. And there seemed to be, a sense of friendship, even bonhomie. But of course, I also have to explain why all of that friendship fell apart. And India and China fought a border war in 1962. And more recently, of course, especially in the last few years, there has been a great deal of tension on the border between India and China, not to mention the border between India and Pakistan. And this is why I suggest that, in Asia, in the best of Asia's political thought, there had always been ideas about a larger Asian federation that accommodated multiple races, multiple religions, that got lost out when independence came. And this is where Europe comes in. I suggest that Asia perhaps accepted a little too uncritically the European model of the nation state, which hadn't served Europe well in the 20th century. Nationalist conflicts had contributed to two cataclysmic world wars, and yet at least managers of Asian states decided to accept a unitary conception of sovereignty from Europe, that a state can be built only on the foundation of one nation, and also a notion of rigid borders, that we must be very jealous about protecting our exact territorial frontiers. And this, I suggested, does not accord very well with Asian conceptions of cosmopolitanism, universalism, even various ideas about an Asian federation that had been circulating from the late 19th century to about the 1950s. So in a sense, I'm urging Asia and Asians to select certain elements from their own inheritance in order to better address problems between Asian nation states that exist today. In some ways, I'm asking Asia to move away from the dogmas that we learned during the long history of European colonial conquest of Asia.
But still, these ideas seem to be pretty persistent, even in Asia, right? If I look at those conflicts, you mentioned the conflict between India and China, which is sometimes a cold, but sometimes a hot conflict. I think a couple of years ago, that was the last major incidents. And that is a conflict, at least on the surface, about a borders in also in part, at least, very unhospitable areas where you could say, well, does it really matter that much whether the border is a few kilometers in that direction or in the other? If I look at the conflicts in the South China Sea, for example, with China and its neighbors, there are conflicts still dating back from the Second World War between Russia and Japan, for example, over some uninhabited islands. So all these things are exactly about what you said. They are about borders, and often at least on the surface, not really about territory that is particularly valuable as such, right? So it may symbolize something, it may have some geostrategic importance, but the territory per se is often not very valuable. So why are those ideas then so persistent if you say that they haven't served Asia well, and they're also not really in Asia's DNA, if you might say so?
You're right that, when the 1962 war was being fought, there was a sense that battles were being waged over territories where nothing grows, and yet two Asian countries were in conflict with one another. Now, Asia cannot ignore the long, history of European colonialism when ideas about unitary sovereignty, hard borders, were imported into Asia from about the mid-19th century onwards. And I think Europe has been struggling to get away from some of those ideas in order to solve some of the conflicts in Europe. And in some ways, it's a great pity that Asia doesn't seem to be more interested in recovering what was best in its own intellectual and political traditions, and instead imitating some of the worst features of Europe's nationalistic imperialism. But all that I'm suggesting is that there are alternatives that need to be explored. And your question raises another very important point. That's the elephant in the room that we probably do need to address, which is China. What does the rise of China mean, not just for the entire world, but for Asia? And it seems to me that China could go in different directions. And even about 10 or 12 years ago, it may have been possible to think of China not pursuing the path of what I have described as nationalistic imperialism, being so finicky about certain islands in the South China Sea, which in themselves don't seem to be that attractive, or certainly not attractive enough to be engaging in a fight with a whole range of Asian neighbors, whether Japan or countries in Southeast Asia. And that's why this book is important as a history. I show how, for example, the nationalist conflict between Japan and China in 1937 had undermined the idea of Asia in that moment in the 20th century. It had shown that Asia was not immune from what was often referred to as the European virus of nationalism and nationalist conflict. And that's why whichever country in Asia appears to be in the lead has a special responsibility. And I end this book on a somewhat pessimistic note, suggesting that the more generous imaginaries of Asia seem to be getting lost, with China taking a more aggressive posture than is probably necessary for its own interest. So it's a complex story. I acknowledge the reality of what is going on in Asia. And if you just read the news, it would seem that it's all about conflict, about fights over borders, India and China, over the Doklam Valley in Bhutan in 2017, or the Galwan Valley in Ladakh, which is a largely barren place, in 2020. And yet, first of all, there are still economic and cultural intertwinings that have grown stronger in the last 40 years or so. And secondly, there are alternatives. So what I'm suggesting is that we are standing at a crossroads. And what should we take from lessons that can be learned from history on the uncertain journey ahead?
You are absolutely right. And also economically, by the way, people sometimes don't realize that there is a significant amount of trade between India and China, and it's also growing apparently. So despite the political conflicts that are going on, economic ties seem to continue to be strong. You said that the leading country in a region has a particular responsibility, and you mentioned China, and you seem to indicate that in your view, China is not maybe taking that responsibility seriously enough, at least not along the ideas that you are developing here, which leads me to the other big country in the region, which is your native India, your own country, which has very recently taken over or overtaken China as the world's most populous country, not yet economically, but in terms of population. Do you think India could play that leading role in Asia when it comes to solving some of these issues that you've highlighted?
I think India can play a very important role in the realm of ideas. However, we also need to understand that there has been a general rise of Asia, of which China has been the leading edge over the last 40 years or so. And so if you look back at 1979, the size of the economies of China and India was roughly the same. But today, the size of China's economy is 6 times that of India. So even though India picked up in terms of the pace of its growth and development, China had grown faster. And that's why there is this fairly big disparity at this moment, even though, as you correctly point out, India has become more populous than China just this past year. So we have to understand that there are certain limits to what India can do as the leader of Asia. And that is why I think India shares with Japan and much of Southeast Asia the notion of a multipolar Asia. Even while acknowledging the size of China's economy and so forth, one needs to have multiple poles, even, within Asia. A unipolar world is something that we don't really want. Similarly, we don't want a unipolar Asia. And in that respect, India, by working closely with other Asian countries, has an important role to play. Now, we of course also know that China's economy has run into some difficulties and that there is a very significant slowdown. But even more important than questions of growth in the future are internal inequalities in both China and India. So on the economic front, there are a couple of conclusions that I come to in this book. First is that Asia has really never benefited from economic autarky. It's only by engaging with one another and with the rest of the globe and trying to set the terms of that engagement that Asia has been able to recover its economic position. And the second point is that internal inequities, class as well as regional, caste in the case of India, all these pose in some ways a graver challenge than necessarily the mutual relations between India and China. So all of these countries need to address the problems of inequity. And if that is done, then this Asian century, about which we started speaking at the beginning of this conversation, can be a truly prosperous one.
You initially said that for you, Asia is more a concept than necessarily a geographic entity. What I find interesting also with respect to India and India's leadership is that I've been working with India quite a lot over the past 2-3 years. And when I listen to political leaders in particular from India, I often hear India talk about leadership role of what is called the global south. So India defining itself as the leading force or the voice of the global south rather than as the voice of Asia. Now, the global south is maybe more difficult even to define than Asia as a concept because it means all sorts of very different things to different people. But is there a distinction? What is India's thinking, or maybe the thinking of the Indian government, if you want to interpret that? Is it more about Asia? Is it more about the global south? Is it a little bit of both? Where does the country see its leadership role on the global stage?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. At this moment, India presents itself as a leader of the global south, or as the voice of the needs and aspirations of the peoples who inhabit the global south, which includes Asia, but also Africa and Latin America. And this effort to build some Asian solidarity, especially given the context of European colonialism in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, and then efforts to build links with Africa and other parts of the world which are considered to be part of the global south, also has a fairly long history. So I show in my book, for example, that there were connections being forged with African Americans in the United States of America. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the most prominent African intellectual of those times, visited Japan and China in 1936. Then I show how Asia-Africa became something of a concept in the 1950s, and not just at Bandung in 1955, which was billed as an Asia-Africa conference. There were many other unofficial meetings of this sort, which included Africa. In Bandung, you did not have many African representatives because Africa was not yet free, and Bandung was a conference of states. But at other meetings, representatives of the freedom movements in the African continent were invited in the 1950s and 1960s. So Asia broadened out to include Africa. And then subsequently, particularly when one looks at the economics of the globe, it seemed that a larger connection could be forged with Latin America as well, which is why India now sees itself as, both an important participant in the Asian Renaissance, if you will, of the early 21st century, but at the same time, it wishes to be a voice of the larger global south. And that is why you find that even though there are official attempts to, let's say, improve relations with the United States of America and also with Europe, there is a global perspective. Asia does not want to close itself off from the larger world. As I said, global engagement has always been important. But when it comes to crucial matters such as the conflict in Ukraine, you will find that India is not quite falling into line with the US or the European position on that particular issue. And that is largely because, the global south thinks differently. Similarly, with the terrible situation now going on in Israel-Palestine, while there has been official improvement in relations with Israel, you can see that India's position is getting to be modulated because both of public opinion in India, but because the global south as a whole has a rather different perspective on the matter by comparison with certainly the United States and certain countries in Europe.
Executive Briefing, what you should read now.
I would like you to give our listeners your recommendations. Obviously, we will also recommend your book for sure and the other books that you have written. We will put all the titles, also those that you mentioned now, in the show notes so that people don't have to take notes while listening. They can look it up in writing and access those informations.
Well, I would actually, given the context of our conversation, strongly recommend a book by Wang Gangwu called Renewal, which shows the different ways in which China might have gone. This is a book published about a decade ago in 2013, and it shows how an early 20th century intellectual called Gu Hongming imagined China's role in Asia and the world. And he shows that Gu Hongming was having a bit of a comeback in China in the early 21st century. So this is a Singaporean-based, very eminent historian who wrote this book, which I think is worth reading. Another book that I would recommend, because you are based in Germany, is by Chris Manjapra. Again, published a decade ago, it's titled Age of Entanglement, and it is about the intellectual encounters between Indians and Germans from the 19th century to about the middle of the 20th century. And what that book will give you is a sense of the tenor of the conversations that were taking place between Asian intellectuals and European intellectuals. It's about India and Germany, but I think it gives you a broader context of the relationship between Asia and Europe and the possibilities of conversation between the two continents.
As always, we will put the titles of those recommendations in our show notes for listeners to look them up. And obviously, we will also include your latest book, Asia After Europe, which we highly recommend, as well as the many other books that you have authored over the course of your career. I would now like to talk a little bit about values. You mentioned identity, you mentioned solidarity, but there's also the question of values. And I would like to ask you, first of all, do you think there are Asian values that are distinct from, say, Western or European values? And if so, which values would you say are universal and which ones differ, so to speak, by region or by entity?
I have tried to steer away from this notion that there are Asian values that are, completely distinct from European values. I don't subscribe to the concept of Asian values as articulated by political figures like Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore or Mahathir Mohamad of Malaysia. And I think it's too simplistic to say that Asians believe in communitarian values, while in Europe there is much more of an emphasis on the individual. My view is that, Asians have a very strong conception of the self and the individual and so on. And so I don't think that those broad distinctions can be made. And I also want to avoid the temptation of saying that Asian values or virtues, however defined, are superior to European values, because that's an inversion. While I want a more sophisticated notion of what might be called an interconnected and an interreferential Asia. Asia trying to learn from different people located in different parts of Asia. However, I do strongly contest a certain European vision of universalism and also cosmopolitanism, because what I show is that European universalism, or a claim to monopoly on universalism, was closely entangled with the history of European imperialism. And there is also a version of cosmopolitanism in European thought, and it's only one version, I acknowledge, but quite a dominant one, which believes that cosmopolitanism can only be derived from abstract reason, Kantian reason, and that somehow, patriotism is the lesser other of cosmopolitanism. What I show is that Asians articulated conceptions of a different universalism, and they simply contested the European claim to monopoly over universalism. So Asians were not just talking about Asian solidarity. They were saying that we have something to contribute to the global future. And also I show, and this is a phrase that I use quite a lot in my book, I suggest that cosmopolitanism need not be colorless, as Kant would have thought, that there can be a peaceful coexistence of cosmopolitanism and patriotism, that you can love your own country and yet believe in cultural exchanges that transcend the boundaries of your own nation. So I suggest that there were many Asian intellectuals who articulated what I describe as a colorful cosmopolitanism, which is very different from a European colorless cosmopolitanism. And that's why I suggest that it's important when we think of questions of reason, of national identity, of federation, to take Asian ideas as seriously, if not more seriously, as European ones, so that we can actually think of a very different kind of an engagement among peoples residing in different parts of the globe.
So is that something that you say Europeans could learn from Asians, this notion of a patriotism that you described that is maybe inherently peaceful or is not necessarily leading to militaristic conflict, imperialism, things like that?
Yes, I mean, of course, it's a kind of patriotism in Asia which is also closely connected with the idea of justice and of equality. But it is a kind of patriotism that ought not to be leading to conflicts between nation states. So, in some ways, what Europe can learn from Asian ideas is how to transcend the European model of the nation state and the conflicts to which that leads. Because after all, I don't think it's a model that goes far beyond the 18th century. It doesn't even go back to Westphalia. It goes back to about the middle of the 18th century. And so I think if Europe and Asia engage in a conversation, we can actually think about a better world, a more peaceful international system for the 21st century.
Let me now get to the other segment of our podcast.
A bold prediction, the world in 10 years.
We ask our guests to take out their crystal ball and to look into the future. Now, of course, as a historian, you look mostly into the past, but of course, as we all know, that's where you learn about the future and the presence. So I will ask you, what do you think in terms of Asia, the ideas that you deliver or develop in your book? Where do you think Asia will stand in 10 years from now, also in relationship to the West, Europe, and other parts of the world?
Historians are better at interpreting the past than in forecasting the future. So what I'm about to say may well be a wish rather than a clear prediction. But I will indulge you, since you're asking me for a bold prediction. I believe that on a 10-year horizon, you will see something of the emergence of an Asian Union, which the European Union will have to be able to negotiate with. And I just hope that this Asian Union will be less state-driven and less bureaucratic than what the European Union has become. And I hope that there will be people and civil societies in various Asian countries which will lead this effort to achieve what so many Asian intellectuals of the first half of the 20th century had visualized as an Asian federation. So I think we will have to look beyond specific nation states in 10 years' time, and we will see regional federations. And the challenge then will be to make sure that these regional federations can live peacefully and in relationship with one another in a larger global formation.
That sounds wonderful. So certainly we wish for those things to come true. I don't want to kind of spoil the beauty of this idea. So does that also mean that you're quite optimistic that there will not be a major armed conflict breaking out in Asia in the near future? Because, of course, we now have war in Europe over Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine. We have the conflict in the Middle East that you mentioned. But of course, what everybody fears in that geopolitical arena is that there will be some sort of an armed conflict breaking out with China, either over the South China Sea or over Taiwan, which would, of course, include the West, primarily the American, the US. So you don't think that will happen? Or do you prefer to resort to wishful thinking when it comes to your prediction for the next 10 years?
I do not rule out the risk of the conflict of the kind that you are mentioning. And this kind of a conflict could result out of a miscalculation rather than, a deliberate policy. But what I'm saying is that there are sufficient intellectual resources that can be drawn from history, which should enable Asia to avoid such a conflict. After all, Asia is poised to recover the position that it had lost 200 years ago. And for that to happen, Asia needs peace in order to be able to genuinely turn the 21st century into an Asian century. So I think the historical and intellectual resources are there to avoid what would otherwise be a cataclysmic conflict. And perhaps I should end with a quotation from the poet Rabindranath Tagore, who had written way back in 1932 that if Asia is to rise, Asians must speak in their own voice. If Asia simply echoes Europe's beastly cry, then even if it were to be the lion's roar, it will be a loss. So let us not lose the human possibilities for the future. That is the sense of hope with which I conclude my book, Asia After Europe.
And that, I think, is also an excellent conclusion for this podcast episode. I think I personally, of course, definitely hope that this will develop in the way that you also hope. This would be wonderful for Asia, but also from the European perspective. I think this would be great for the rest of the world as well, if there is peace and prosperity in Asia. A lot of these things economically, but also otherwise, there are no fixed pies. So, we can all benefit from that. They're not competitive goals in and by itself. Professor Bose, thank you very much for this very, very interesting, very thoughtful conversation. I think I myself, but also our listeners, have learned a great deal about Asia and also about the past of the continent, but also about its future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I truly enjoyed my conversation with you.
This was another episode of the Business Diplomacy Today podcast. This podcast is presented by the Indo-German Center for Business Excellence. If you like the show, make sure to subscribe to it on your favorite podcasting platform. And of course, we would also be delighted if you would leave a review or a rating there. You can also go to our website at businessdiplomacy.today to check out the show notes of this episode. And that's it for today. Thanks for listening.